And good morning, everybody, and welcome back to day 4 of the California Small Farm Conference. We're excited to have you here for today's workshop. We are going to be learning about practical tools for implementing regenerative agricultural practices. We are very excited to have two wonderful speakers here who have shown up to provide their expertise. And hopefully engage you all in a conversation about this important topic. For those of you out there listening, I hope that you will interact with today's workshop. Two ways you can do that. One is through the chat at the bottom of your screen. We encourage you to use that to introduce yourselves, comment, share insights of your own. But if you have questions specifically for today's presenters, we encourage you to use the Q&A feature, which is different from the chat. So if you look down at your bottom, you'll see a little button that says Q&A. Drop your question in there, and we'll make sure to get you an answer before the workshop is over. Today's workshop is being recorded. We're going to post that up at CAF's YouTube channel if you want to check it out later. And with that, thanks for being here bright and early, and pass it on to you, Sarah. Nick, thank you so much for being here.
Great, thanks, Evan. Good morning. Let me share my screen. Good?
Yeah, looks good.
Okay, great. So thanks so much for the introduction. I'm Sarah Light. I'm a farm advisor with the University of California Cooperative Extension, and I'm also the president of the Western Cover Crops Council, which is how I know Nick Andrews, who I'll let introduce himself before we start.
Yeah, my name is Nick Andrews. I have been at OSU since 2005, Oregon State University, and currently I serve as an organic vegetable extension specialist with a new team of organic ag agents.
Yeah. So thank you, Nick, for co-presenting this workshop with us. I put the caveat in the title in parentheses in annual systems because we're both sort of annual systems experts. So we'll be focusing primarily on that, but many of the concepts are applicable to a range of cropping systems. We encourage folks to put questions in the chat, as Evan said, and we'd love to really engage as much as possible through this workshop format, though we do have quite a lot of material we're excited to share. We're primarily going to be talking about equipment today, but to start, I wanted to give a quick overview of regenerative agriculture. What is regenerative agriculture? It's sort of a topic that's really emerging as a topic of interest, a lot of exciting work being done in it. The state itself, the Department of Food and Ag, had some listening sessions to define it for their programs. And so it's sort of nebulous as to what the definition is. But when I put this, some of this talk together with equipment for regenerative agriculture practices, I asked some of the growers that I work with who implement a lot of regenerative agriculture practices what their definitions were and how they implemented on their farm. And what they said was the foundation of it is controlled traffic and targeted tillage. So in other words, driving over a limited part of the ground and then reducing disturbance. So really it's maintaining soil structure. Another one said that the foundation of regenerative agriculture is to add a lot of biomass and then followed that with saying, don't get yourself into a high residue situation if you aren't prepared to manage it. So I would say a lot of this talk is focused on the management of residue as well as how to kind of implement these practices in the beginning. To take a bird's eye view, when we kind of want to connect soil health to regenerative agriculture, soil health by definition is the capacity of the soil to function as a vital living ecosystem that sustains plants, animals, and humans. It's really at that intersection between the physical, chemical, and biological aspects of soil. And I think many of us have probably heard this definition before. You might be thinking, why would I start my talk with that? Well, I want to draw your attention to this word to function and think about what that means. To function means to work or operate in a proper or particular way, to be in working or running order, to play the role of, to do duty as. So essentially, we need our soil to do certain jobs for agriculture and society at large. We refer to those sometimes as ecosystem services. Some of those jobs include, but are not limited to, providing space for roots to grow, providing space for roots to breathe, allowing water to infiltrate, moving water really rapidly during a heavy rain event to reduce flooding, storing water, providing habitat for organisms. These are all the functions that we hope to improve through implementation of regenerative agriculture practices. These are the functions and the jobs that we're hoping soil will do better when we build soil health. And so that really is that kind of tie-in between those physical attributes and this broad definition. When we think about that classic NRCS, the principles of soil health, minimizing disturbance, maximizing a living root, maximizing soil coverage, and maximizing biodiversity, the two that we can really cover with our equipment management is these two. And so a lot of what we'll be talking about is sort of these concepts. Um, and Nick will talk a bit about cover crop selection, which ties into a few others as well. This is a little bit of data from California that I'd like to share about the value of implementing these. This is from some long-term plots down in 5 Points that were in place for almost 20 years, where they did a combination of reduced tillage as well as cover crops. So it was a reduced tillage, yes or no, with cover crop, yes or no. And so it was 4 treatments total. And this is infiltration time in seconds. And so the shorter the bar, the faster the water infiltrates. With reduced tillage and a cover crop, the water infiltrated faster. With reduced tillage and no cover crop, the water still infiltrated quite fast. And then with the cover crop only, with standard tillage, there was still an improvement in infiltration. Combining those practices, most did reduce infiltration time, though cover crops alone were also able to improve infiltration. I always try to encourage people to do whatever tools they can for implementing the practices, and that's why a lot of our talk is kind of focused on the concepts, because you might have different equipment on your farm, or different crops or different considerations. But overall, moving water rapidly into the soil in a heavy rain event is quite critical for our landscape as well as for getting water in for later for our crops. And then just to show this connection between soil biology and the physical attributes that I've talked about a little bit. This is macrofauna abundance or soil biology here on the x-axis. It's the same for all of the graphs. And then on the graphs going left to right, total soil carbon increases as macrofauna abundance increases. Infiltration time goes down as macrofauna abundance decreases. So less rapid infiltration with less biological diversity. And then the soil stability class rating or aggregate stability or the resilience of the soil to not break down in a saturated condition also increases with biological abundance. And so there is a really tight connection. I just wanted to show this because we're not talking a lot about soil biology in these talks, but ultimately soil biology is a major driver and a major consideration for a lot of this work. This is a picture of a way of an excellent looking field that is fallow. It has a lot of residue on it. There are areas here that there might be a little bit of disturbance from some targeted weed control to try to get, I know there was bad morning glory in this field, so to try to get some of that morning glory up. But still there's good soil coverage, good soil armor, good protection in the winter. I'm going to talk about controlled traffic farming as my last slide before I pass it over to Nick. Controlled traffic farming, which I had in one of my first slides as one of the big recommendations from a grower for what regenerative agriculture is, essentially means that you don't work up the whole field. So you have permanent beds and permanent drive areas, and you never drive over those beds. Why is that important? Because equipment is really heavy and it can compact where you're driving um, over and really compress that soil. And so if you kind of limit your area of disturbance or driving, then you maintain and preserve really good soil structure in the beds where you're growing your crops. The essence of it is that you're just always driving in the same place in the field. You have essentially permanent lanes. It reduces compaction. The one main thing that you need for this is GPS on all your equipment because nobody is so perfect that they'll be able to stay in that exact place in a field. And so that's kind of the caveat. But this can be a great first step if it's accessible to kind of control traffic farming and implementing regenerative ag practices.
Well, thank you very much, Sarah. We're going to jump into quite a bit more detail on some equipment. And in this talk, we're primarily talking about mechanized farming. And a lot of these same principles can be used at a hand scale or a smaller scale. But the farmers that Sarah and I have been working with are mainly using tractors. Um, when you're trying to choose a cover crop, it can be overwhelming at first. There's so many different species, so many different functions, and a good place to start is being clear about your objectives. And this bullet list here are pretty commonly mentioned as objectives or goals that farmers want to achieve with their cover crops. And the science behind all of them is pretty complex, but most of them are pretty robust claims. But of course, it always depends on the details. There's lots of devils in the details. Go ahead to the next slide. Once you've chosen your main objectives with your cover crops, choose the species that you think are going to perform those functions the best and focus. That's what I always do with growers that I'm working with, focus on those species. There's a lot of promotion of kind of a shotgun approach in a way of lots and lots of different species, and sometimes those can be effective, but they can also be fairly expensive. So if you are focus on the functions that you're looking for and the species that provide those functions, and broadly speaking, cereals protect soil very well. They cover the soil quickly, can increase organic matter and compete with weeds. If you have 100% cereals or grasses in your cover crop, it can immobilize nitrogen after incorporation, which might be a problem. It would mean that in order to counteract that, you'd have to apply more fertilizer. Legumes also protect soil, and they can, if you've got a legume dominated stand, they can provide nitrogen, release nitrogen when they're breaking down and offset immobilization from cereals. It doesn't take much legume in the mix to offset that immobilization. Legumes can also pollinate nectar, and then other broadleaves like Phacelia, buckwheat in the summer, mustards, if you know that there's a lot of issues potentially with mustards, but they can also protect the soil, compete well with weeds, and they don't have quite as high a risk of immobilizing nitrogen as pure cereal stands. We're in the process of developing the WCCC cover crop selection tool that Sarah will talk about a little bit later. And then there is a link to the Western Cover Crop Council website. I'll also have a QR code later in the slide deck. Go ahead to the next slide, please. So let's start with seeds. We want to get to some slides about seeding equipment that we've been working with in Oregon. And seeds come in, very small seeds like Balanza clover. There you can see 500,000 seeds to the pound, and then very large seeds like fava beans, 2,500 seeds to the pound. So when you're metering seeds in a seeder, sometimes some equipment it works better with small seeds. Some equipment is designed to work with large seeds. When you look at like the the SARE book, Managing Cover Crops Profitably, you can get some pretty reasonable guidelines for seeding rates, but bear in mind, really our end goal is a certain number of plants per square foot or plants per acre, right? A crop density. So it's useful. We don't have precise guides of number of seeds of cover crops to plant per acre, but it's useful to think through how many plants you're going to end up per square foot. When you're looking at that Dixie crimson clover image is from a seed tag. And we talk about pure live seed, which is basically in a 50-pound bag, there's a lot of things other than just seed. There could be weeds, there could be coatings, just dust, and also dead seed. So in order to figure out how many live seeds that can potentially become a plant are there in a 50-pound bag, you need to do a little bit of math. And I picked this seed tag because it was inoculated clover. So if you go ahead and hit next, Sarah, in fact, you can hit next twice or three times, and then yeah, one more time. So at the top there, it says pure seed 50%, if you can read that. And that's because it's inoculated. So 50% of the weight of that bag is the inoculant, the rhizobium inoculant. And then the germination percentage is 85%. So 15% of that seed is dead, right? And so 0.5, 50% pure seed times 0.85, 85% germination equals 42.5% pure live seed. So in that 50-pound bag, there's 21 and a quarter pounds of pure live seed. So that's quite a bit different than if you had uninoculated clover. So for example, this crimson clover, on average, it's going to vary by variety, has got about 150,000 seeds per pound, and 42.5% pure live seed equals about 63,600 live seeds per pound. Um, so if you're applying 30 pounds of this seed per acre, that's about 1.9 million live seeds per acre, or about 44 seeds per square foot. So that's just one example of how you can kind of run through this math to see what you're actually planting. Go ahead to the next slide. Um, the math gets a little confusing. So on this website that I put together with some soil scientists at OSU several years ago, we've developed some calibration spreadsheets. You can print them out as worksheets, like shown here in this screenshot, or you can use them on your computer as a spreadsheet, and they can help when you're adjusting your seeder to make sure that you're getting your seeding rate in the right ballpark. Go ahead to the next slide. So let's talk a little bit about different types of seeders. I think there's an animation. Go ahead and hit that next. So spreaders are the simplest, and the simplest kind of seeder. One of the benefits is that they can meter out a pretty wide range of seed sizes. So here is a research assistant of mine a while ago spin spreading cover crop seed onto a winter squash field. And this farmer, Jim Bronick, is the one that actually inspired me to start working on interseeding. He's been doing it quite a bit in his butternut squash, and getting wonderful stands of red clover, crimson clover, after the following season. So at the time, this is about the time he would be going in for his last weed cultivation, right before the butternut squash vines out and creates a solid canopy. That's when he walks on. That's when he spins on the seed. And because that's very small seed, he's able to just incorporate that into the soil with irrigation rather than some sort of mechanical incorporation. And then that's a picture of a red Gandy drop spreader. I've got one of those that I work with. They're very robust. They take a little bit of work to calibrate, but that works pretty well. And if I'm using larger seed, which is basically bird food, if you leave it on the surface, and also in addition to predation from birds, if you don't incorporate larger seed, they'll tend to dry out on the surface. When you're interseeding cover crops, you want to realize you're putting in a cold hardy crop or a winter annual crop in the heat of the summer. So you often want to be able to get that seed into the soil and get good seed to soil contact. And ring rollers or rakes are pretty simple ways of doing that if you don't have a drill or more sophisticated way of incorporating seed. Go ahead to the next slide. Um, so I did that for a few years with Jim and some other farmers with different ways of incorporating their seed, using spreaders. I mean, spin spreaders or drop spreaders. And then about 5 or 6 years ago, started looking for ways to interseed larger seed sizes into standing vegetable crops. And this is the yellow walk behind tool is a Jang seeder. That's actually a clean seeder model, which is basically all the parts are interchangeable. You might have heard of Jang, you might have heard of clean seeder. That Sutton Ag sells those in down in California, and that's where I get mine from. They sell those clean seeders, or Jang does as well. Johnny sells the Jang seeders. A few other vendors do too, with multiple gangs, so you can walk on 3 to 6 rows of seed at once, I think. And there's two, and then the green one in the lower right of the slide, that's a tractor mounted. It's the same type of mechanism, same manufacturer, but it's much heavier duty for tractor mounting. And the two features that you want to think about if you're interested in this are whether to go with the plate seeder on the top right there. Sorry, back to yeah, whether to go with the plate seeder, which is the disc with the holes that you can see, or the roller seeder. And the rollers tend to be better with small seed, although they've got some rollers that I've been surprised I've been able to get triticale and common vetch to flow through reasonably well. And the plate seeders work a lot better with large seed. So if you're looking at, peas, crimson clover, most cereals, some of the oats have pretty large seed, fava beans, etc. You might want to go with a plate seeder. So you kind of have to commit to one or the other in order to do that. Another consideration is the type of opener, and the default is the shoes there. I think if there's an animation here, Sarah, if you click once. Um, Sorry, go back to the previous slide. Go back to the previous slide. Thank you. So yeah, the shoes are sort of the default, and they're okay if you've got a really finely prepared seed bed, but if you've got a little bit of trash on the field, which is a good thing, right? You've got biomass on the surface. Disc openers do a lot better job. You can actually, they're not, this isn't like a heavy no-till disc, but I've been surprised at what kind of levels of residues I can cut through with the disc openers. Okay, next slide. Um, and then I kind of wish I'd bought a set of Planet Junior seeders from Coal Planter. I'll show you some pictures of a farmer actually adapted what we were doing, and she had a bunch of old Planet Juniors that she used. The nice thing, these are a little bit different the way they work. You can see that in the bottom right, that's they've got basically an auger driven, ground driven auger that spins. So there's that white disc on that green rod, and that's a brush type, and that agitates the seed, and the seed just drops through the bottom of that hopper, through the hole in the bottom of that hopper. And then those three plates that you can see drawn right above there, that sorry, these three plates, they've got different holes, a range of different holes, and you'd attach that below the hopper and just choose your hole size so that the seed falls through at about the right rate. And then you calibrate that by spinning the drive wheel in your shop. And then you can also do some field calibration to make sure you're at about the right seeding rate. And these they can handle a really impressive range of seed sizes. I went with the clean seeder because they're a little bit more accurate, but in retrospect, if I was buying, these are similar price, I would probably go with the Coal Planter just because that adaptability to a bunch of different seed sizes is wonderful. One of the problems is that they don't seem to have, I haven't been able to find disc openers for Planet Juniors available. Basically, they're all shoes. You can see that green shoe there. But a farmer, Gathering Together farm here in Philomath, told me recently that they have a set of old Planet Juniors that do have disc openers. So it might be, it would be possible to sort of fabricate that or maybe find some old
Mhm.
disc openers.
I
Okay,
have I actually have one, Nick, that I use. And
oh, you do?
yeah, I have one that I use to plant small plots, and I find the opener works okay. It's actually the closing behind the seed row that
Yeah,
is a little bit challenging. So sometimes you have to kind of step
yeah,
it a little bit because it'll be too exposed.
yeah, yeah,
But it is
yeah.
a great,
I
it is a
haven't
great
used
piece of
these.
equipment. Pretty fast to use too once you get it calibrated.
Yeah, yeah. Go ahead to the next slide, and yeah, hit one more time. There's that animation. Okay, so this is the most accurate, sort of most bulletproof way to seed cover crops is with a no-till, with a drill. And this is an example of a no-till drill, which has got heavy um, fluted or wavy discs that cut through residue more effectively than a standard drill. And the seed drops down tubes here. You can see there's a double disc opener in the front that opens up a trough or a furrow, and then the seed drops down in the furrow, and then there's different way rollers, discs, and other ways of sort of filling in the furrow. And they've got good metering, different types of metering, augers and things for controlling how much seed you're dropping. And you can actually get fairly good depth control. So if you're managing moisture, you can go down even 2 or 3 inches sometimes with some cover crop seed and get a good establishment, drilling into moisture. So that, go ahead to the next slide. And here's a picture of what this was, a sunflower seed that just got, it looks like flail
Wheat
mode.
planted into sunflower residue. So the grower just used that no-till drill from the previous picture to plant their wheat right in. I wanted to show this as an example of how much residue can be left after you seed with a no-till drill, if you're not incorporating that residue. So there can be a bunch of biomass left in the field in that case.
Yeah,
Very
and this,
effective equipment.
this kind of raises a good point too, is that you don't need to, with cover crops, you can apply a little bit more seed, and you don't need to work up such a fine seed bed, as fine a seed bed as if you're seeding carrots or a cash crop, right? And you can save a lot of soil disturbance and tillage, just by reducing the amount of tillage. This was developed. This interseeder is a really nice tool. It was developed by graduate students at Penn State, I think it was, and they're commercially available. It's basically a high clearance interseeding drill. So it's a no-till drill like that previous slide. And you can see the coulters there, and then the press wheels that go behind after the seed has been dropped. But it's got really high clearance, so you can go into a standing crop and you can remove some of the drills, some of the discs, so that you're obviously not taking out your crop. So this is interseeding at about the same time as the last weed cultivation, getting great seed to soil contact, good depth control, and they've also got a clover box for small seed, and then the main box for larger grains and other seed. Okay, go ahead. And we've got one of those at OSU. It's the one we have there. You saw it's a wide load, so it's a little dodgy taking it on for on-farm trials, but we do that a little bit. And they do have a smaller one, but mostly they're working with farmers in the Midwest, so they've got quite a few larger models of that. It's pretty heavy, so that it gets good. It cuts through a lot of residue, so they take fairly large, relatively large tractors for the size, for the width of equipment. So back to the previous slide, Sarah, sorry. So this is the establishment from the interseeder in some crops. The first one there is about 10 days after seeding. The top one on the middle is about 25 days, 28 days after seeding. So you can see that we're getting pretty good stands. And then in the pumpkins there, that's annual ryegrass on the left, that was interseeded with a no-till drill. And then on the bottom is it's a triticale common vetch mix that was, and this is in March or April, and it was interseeded into purple sprouting broccoli in the summer, or August, early September. This is Laura Masterson, and this is a kale crop at her farm, 47th Avenue farm, with really, you can see really vigorous triticale vetch. And this is basically around her last crop harvest time. And one thing you do want to think about is if you're using, and this is, Laura and I've talked about this a lot, is being careful with vining cover crops when you've got overwintered cash crops that go into the spring. That they can obviously become a little bit of a challenge for harvest. But go ahead to the next crop. To be honest, I found the bigger challenge has been getting the cover crops to establish. More has been a little bit more of a problem than too much biomass getting in the way of harvest. So this was from Ed Peachy's trial. He's the one that originally bought the interseeder technology, that big blue machine, and he was getting about 57 pounds of, well, let's look at the cover crops and the weeds. in the interest of time. In the sprouting broccoli there that you saw, about 80 pounds of total nitrogen, 23 pounds of plant available nitrogen. And those numbers actually look pretty low to me. I think what he might have been doing there is just sampling kind of the whole field rather than sampling the cover crop row. You're not going to get as high. We can often get 80 or 100 pounds of plant available nitrogen from a full field cover crop. And then in the leeks, he was getting about 60 pounds of total nitrogen, 20 pounds of plant available nitrogen. And that asterisk is he was wondering if that might be actually a little bit of an underestimate. Go ahead to the next slide. So we've been trying to get some cheaper, that interseeder technology, it's set up to seed. You can also set it up as a full field drill where where you've got the whole gang of discs so that you're drilling a whole field after harvest, as well as an interseeder. But it's dual purpose machine because it can also spray liquid fertilizers or pesticides. And I'm working mainly with organic growers, so that sprayer was a little bit less useful to them. So we've been looking at other dual purpose tools. And so like I mentioned earlier, there's the clean seeder, the walk behind clean seeder. There's ours that's got it seeds 3 rows of cover crop between the vegetable row. Obviously, you can also use that if you've got one already for seeding vegetables, try using it for interseeding cover crops. That's probably the tool that I bought that I actually have a sign out sheet now when I lend it to farmers because I lend it to a farmer. Several farmers ask me, "Can I borrow your clean seeder?" And then they just keep it. I have to when I want to use it, I have to remember where it is and go and get it. So I highly recommend those. They just because they've been so popular. This next one on the right there, it's the tractor mounted clean seeder. We welded together a tandem toolbar because we wanted to get each row of cover crop seeds about 6 inches apart in the alleyways between the crops, and the machine, the tool, the seeders are too wide to get your seed rows that close. So that's why we set up with the tandem toolbar. You can see we've got 2 in the back here and 1 in the front to get them closer. So when the tractor is going that way, it's seeding 2 rows of cover crop, 3 rows of cover crop, 2 rows of cover crop. When Clint turned around at the end of the field, this tire ended up coming this direction towards us. And then in this row, in this alleyway, it put another 2 rows of cover crop, and then 3 rows of cover crop, and then 2 rows of cover crop. So what you end up with is a pattern of 3 rows of cover crop, 4 rows of cover crop, 3 rows, 4 rows, 3 rows between each of your vegetable crops. Go ahead and go to the next slide and click play. So this is Sarah Wines, one of the crew leader at Laura Masterson's farm, and she's driving the interseeder through. So one of the weaknesses with this is I had to choose whether to get the plate seeder or the roller seeder. I went with the plate seeder for a large seed, so that was a compromise. And it doesn't, I tried adapting the plates to seed clover and I couldn't get it to work. It just, you really need the rollers for small seeded crops. The other weakness is that each one of these seeders is ground driven with its own drive wheel. So they've got a parallelogram so they can float a little bit, but if you're in an uneven field, it's really easy for one of the seeders to be floating in midair and then it's not dropping any seed. And so you're constantly kind of checking back to see if you've adjusted your equipment right and all of the seeders are engaging. Go ahead to the next slide. And this is just another quick video of the same thing. Oh, yeah. This is just a little bit more of a close up. It's only a few seconds, but you can see the double disc openers and they do a really pretty good job. And then the drive wheel also serves as the press wheel. And there's a little disc under there that's spring loaded that knocks seed. So I actually been pretty happy with this, the way this covers seed, as long as the drive wheel's engaging. All right, you can go to the next slide. And then this was fall cauliflower during harvest. So this was interseeded in August 16th, and then this is October 17th. And this is a young woman on her harvest crew. I just happened to show up when they were picking that day, and she said this was on the left is a bare ground control plot, and then here's where we put Lana Vetch in. And I asked her what she thought of the cover crop, and she loved it because, and I never expected this, my bins don't get muddy. It's like I've got a green carpet as I'm going through the field. So that really saved them a lot of time washing, which was cool. And then this is April 20th, and you can see it's not a ton of biomass because you've only got strips of Lana Vetch in there. That's not a solid plant or a solid crop, but still we estimated about nearly 70 pounds of fertilizer value. So, and that was a lot different from the estimates that Ed was getting. And what I'm doing is focusing on the part of the row where the cover crop was seeded. So I'm thinking that might be why we've got such different results. I think he might have been taking a sample across the whole field to estimate the fertilizer value. And
Hey,
about,
Nick, just a quick time check. Sorry, but
yeah, yeah.
yeah.
Okay, go ahead to the next slide. So these are some results from this is a tool that Laura set up. She bolted together a tandem toolbar and then used her Planet Junior. She had about 7 that she got from an auction, and we had to clean them up, get them all working properly, and we use that quite a bit. And you can see this is a bunch of different crops, a bunch of different cash crops, a bunch of different cover crops, and a few different pieces of equipment that we used to seed the cover crops. And this is the dry weight per acre that we were getting and the plant available nitrogen per acre that we were getting. So pretty good, pretty good results across a bunch of different scenarios last year. Okay, go ahead to the next slide. I won't go through that. The latest, I'm just about done here, Sarah. The latest piece of equipment I've been working with is a fertilizer side dresser. This is from Mechanical Transplanter in Holland, Michigan. And we put convex scatter plates on the bottom of their drop hoses. So this is one of the nice things about this is these huge hoppers. So you don't need to fill your hopper very often. And the scatter plates scatter the seed between the row. You do get a little bit of seed in the crop row, but it doesn't get incorporated. So that hasn't really been a problem. And then this is as it came. I've put this together from the factory with their cultivating bars behind them. And I didn't like this. It didn't do a very good job of incorporating the seeds. So we worked with a team of engineering students here, and they set up these rollers on basically on hinges, right? And then there's a chain here that lifts the roller up when you lift the whole equipment up on your 3-point as you're turning around at the end of the field. And those ring rollers do a lot better. We got about a 30% improvement in seed to soil contact. They also moved these cultivators to the front, but the way that they set that up, it got clogged up. So that's what I'm working on now, is trying to get the cultivators working in the front. Go ahead to the next slide. I don't know why that one's there. Go ahead to the next slide. Oh, okay. Yeah. So treat your crop like a cover crop, not an afterthought. And most of the benefits of cover crops are associated with cover crop biomass, not all of them, but most of them. So if you do plan your cover crop well ahead of time, you can get a lot of those benefits that are often touted. And I'll pass it over to, okay, that I deleted that slide in my version. Go ahead.
Okay, thanks, Nick. I'm gonna just share some um, tidbits from some growers who were very experienced cover croppers in California. Main advice is pick a cover crop that you can manage in the spring no matter what. That includes terminating the cover crop and establishing the cash crop, considering your biomass, height, timing of cash crop, including digestion. From the growers I've talked to in annual systems in California, 10 to 30 days is kind of what they wait for breakdown, with 14 days being the most common. That gives a little bit of time for the biomass to break down and it kind of digest before the field is a little too hot for planting seeds and other crops right in. The more residue in the spring, the more the risk that you'll have to use tillage to incorporate it. And so it's kind of important, a consideration. I would say the most important consideration is to pick a cover crop that you can terminate no matter what the conditions. A high volume of high carbon residue in a wet spring is a worst case scenario that was shared by a grower. A high carbon residue would be a grass, typically is like the highest in carbon. And in a wet spring where you're really struggling to kind of get out there in those limited windows to work the field. Legumes tend to break down faster and have a lower risk, so they're very user friendly. I would say vetch if you're picking a cover crop that you just want to try out and see how it incorporates, and it melts away pretty quickly and is easy to incorporate. One grower shared that they had started planting multi-species for the animals, for the diet of the animals. They had always, for many years, done a single species and been very happy. But then when they started incorporating grazing and livestock, they wanted more of that diversity of forage for the animals. In terms of considering soil moisture, a pre-irrigation and residue breakdown are pretty critical. And then if you have an early versus late spring cash crop planting, that can really drive your decision in cover crop selection because you might be hoping to accomplish certain goals with that cover crop. And if you're planting very early in the spring, then your cover crop might not have the time to achieve those goals before you need to terminate it. And so, with the selection tool that we're developing at the Western Cover Crops Council that Nick mentioned, that is one of the big considerations is that ability to accomplish and achieve the goal at the, before you need to get in there for your cash crop planting window or for some other termination event. So I'm now going to focus on not incorporating cover crops, on terminating cover crops. Somebody asked in the Q&A about weed control with reduced tillage. I'll talk about that a bit. But to start, I wanted to just make sure that we all are kind of have in our minds the difference between targeted versus traditional tillage. So traditional tillage is very like a very broad approach. You create these horizontal layers of different densities, which is how you get a hard pan because as the soil settles, um, it kind of breaks up by different sizes. The field is uniform, which can be a great advantage for some reasons, but there are many disadvantages regarding soil health, soil structure, and that's why traditional tillage is really kind of what we're really trying to encourage people to move away from a regenerative agriculture perspective. In traditional tillage, weeds are controlled between the planting rows. The soil is really inverted and the residue is buried. So you have a much higher risk of erosion, compaction, runoff, moisture loss. Really, those things we're trying to build in our soil with these good regenerative ag and soil health practices. In contrast, on the left, this is targeted tillage. I use the word targeted, not no-till, because it can be extremely challenging to do a complete no-till situation. I think if you can do no-till completely, that's really wonderful. I do know a few growers who are doing it, but I know more growers who are really embracing the concepts of regenerative ag and doing targeted tillage, which means that they're really reducing their disturbance of the soil. And I would say if you can even reduce a tillage pass from 2 a year to 1 a year, or reduce the intensity of the equipment that you're using for tillage, those are all wins and are steps towards building your soil health. So we shouldn't be um, too stressed to accomplish the whole goal of no-till right away. We want to incorporate these practices to reduce. So with targeted tillage, there's no uniform soil depth, no soil movement horizontally. You don't have that density change, and you have a lot less disturbance. So you're able to maintain that residue on the top of the bed in that picture that we showed in the beginning while managing residue in the seed bed. So how do we do that? Here are some pictures from farms in California specifically for that. I have a range of equipment here, and I'll try to explain what they do so that you might be able to think about different equipment that you have and how it could be adjusted to work in your operation. Some of this equipment the farmers have fabricated themselves to meet their needs. This is a Yetter stripper tiller. It's a vertical tillage tool. So a horizontal tillage tool again kind of flips that to soil, and a vertical tillage tool tills this way. So you're really reducing that area of disturbance. This can be very efficient. In the picture, these are the um, kind of where you do this incorporation. So you can see it kind of does this tillage on the seed bed. So it's a really great way, for example, to terminate a cover crop and plant your cash crop in a following a wet winter or spring where you want to just get a little bit of disturbance in that planting row so you can get your crop out there when time is of the essence. And then at a later date, you can go back and figure out how to manage other residue if necessary once it's dried down. So as it's pictured here, it's set up for crops that would be planted in 2 rows on a 60-inch bed, like corn or peas. So this would cover 2 beds at a time. But the nice thing about this is that it has adjustable setup. So you can do, here is 2 rows on a 60-inch bed. Sorry, I misspoke. And then above, this is single line on 4 40-inch beds. So these are from 2 different growers in California who use different bed sizes for their operation. This is a ripper stripper. It's a little bit of a more intense vertical tillage tool, but still only tills kind of in that one targeted zone. It works well in most soil conditions. It doesn't have that kind of roller crumbler. It has a disc and here, and it can minimize disturbance. It's really useful for high amounts of residue, and it also loosens soil in the center of the bed. And then in the back, you might be able to see in this picture, there are shorter shanks. Um, that is actually a way to kind of just make sure you can get a good planting row. You can shorten the shanks with more moisture or make them deeper in a drier condition. So somebody asked in the chat, one of the Q&As, if you always drive in the same driveway, won't you have compaction in that area? And then how do you reduce compaction? The main way to avoid compaction on your farm is to not work the soil when wet. Soil is like a sponge, and so if you think of a wet sponge, when it's wet, it's really pliable and you can scrunch it, but a sponge that's been wet and then dry is more firm. So when it's dry, it just holds its structure better and can be harder to degrade. In terms of mitigating compaction, it's much easier to avoid getting into a compaction situation than to deal with it later. So I would say avoiding working the field when wet is a #1 thing to do. Incorporating organic material, biomass, that is what increases and improves our soil structure because as microbes break up organic matter, they release root exudates that work almost like glue in our soil and hold together our little particles, making aggregates again. And so that process can be very slow as compared to one disc in a wet when the soil is too wet, which can lead to compaction quite rapidly. To answer the question, does it increase compaction in the drive row? Yes, but the idea is that you're reducing the risk of compaction in your planted row, and so you don't have the risk of roots not being able to grow from compaction. You have good microbial respiration in the bed. So some things are sort of unavoidable with equipment, but using bigger tires is helpful because that moves the weight to a bigger area and reduces the risk of compaction. So like a bigger tire size and lighter equipment if possible are sort of the strategies for that. Here's another vertical tillage tool. In this case, it has an undercutting knife. In terms of weed management from a no-till or reduced tillage perspective, I would say this heavy undercutting knife is a very important consideration because it cuts basically the plant and root off of each other, and so there's no opportunity for regrowth. Similarly, with a cover crop termination, this undercutting knife can be really great because it'll kill the cover crop but not require intense disturbance, and then that biomass can stay on the top. So in this picture, but I would say an undercutting knife can be added to many equipment pieces that you have for beds as an implement to kind of just get under. And then in this case, it just goes 3 to 4 inches under the soil. So it's pretty shallow where the soil is a little drier. In this piece of equipment, the front is a 20-inch straight culture disc, and then in the back are straight wavy culture discs that sort of line up. And so you have really good kind of disc on disc, but staggered. What it does is it chops and presses the residue into the soil. So what this particular grower does is that they compost first, and then they run this, and they do their undercutting knife, and they can control weeds and then really get in there for their planting. They can also run a chisel in the middle if they need. If they have really bad compaction, they can get a deeper thing in. And so I think that's the thing is there are opportunities for more aggressive tillage if needed. If you have a totally compacted field, you might have to either plant a cover crop that is like really, really good at compaction breaking and do a ton of work with some risk of yield loss to get that soil structure up, or you might have to do a little bit of a chisel one time and then hopefully reduce tillage in other periods. This is the Power Harrow. This is a little bit of a more intense tool because it is quite powerful. But the nice thing about it is it can shallowly incorporate a lot of residue on the top of the bed. So unlike some other more traditional equipment that really disturbs the soil at a deeper level, this Power Harrow is quite effective. And it has little rotating tines that do that incorporation. A regular harrow would plug up with the surface residue that this grower has. So this is a grower that does really a lot of cover cropping, has a lot of organic matter in their field, and so they're able to use this to incorporate residue before planting without doing huge disturbance. So they get that still that benefit of organic matter. This is another example of a kind of a incorporation tool with an undercutting knife on it. So this is a full bed Lilliston. Um, it does leave the soil level, which is great. It leaves the beds level so you don't have to come back and re kind of pull all your beds. That's another consideration. If you're able to maintain those beds there, you have to do less work to kind of rebuild. All of that is less passes over the field and less disturbance for your soil. So in this particular piece of equipment, there are spider gangs on the top that incorporate and cut the residue, and then the knife kills the roots underneath without turning that soil over in a more traditional tillage, very disturbing soil disturbance way. It's good for lighter materials, so it's not as effective for very heavy or very dense cover crop material or other biomass, which is why we recommend thinking about what kind of cover crop you're going to plant and how you're going to terminate that cover crop before you plant it. This is the Horsch Joker disc. It's a disc with a fixed blade in the front and then a roller flex plaque in the back to stabilize. So that's able to make a more shallow disc as needed. It doesn't have as like deep of a disc for cultivation. It also pulls beds at the same time. And so this grower is able to really transition from a cover crop into a field ready to be planted into a summer cash crop with beds after one pass of the joker after the flail mower. I'll talk about the flail mower a little bit later, but this tool can be very comprehensive for kind of doing that. So if you can do multiple passes at once, you know, Nick was talking about weed control, interseeding. Those are all things that he was kind of showing in one pass. As many things as you can accomplish in one pass, again, it just reduces that weight over the field and kind of that potential risk. I work in Sutter and Colusa County here, the Buttes in the background, and this is some pictures of being bedded up after a rice crop, high straw left. This is the joker as well, and then this is the joker coming out of a another commodity. I believe this is vetch, but you can see it's effective for a range of residue. The flail mower can be very effective as well. It basically flays with these sharp knives that are important to keep sharp and breaks down a lot of biomass very fast. The smaller the pieces of biomass are, the easier the microbes can break it down. And that goes for both a cash or a cover crop. Um, so the flail mower essentially goes through, cuts up the pieces really small, and then you can follow it with some of these pieces of equipment that I've shared or other equipment to kind of make sure it's ready to be planted. Here is a picture of a flail mower basically cutting down a very high uh, brassica cover crop that's almost the height of the tractor, so it can be very effective for big biomass cover crops. And then sun hemp, so sometimes you end up, you know, you don't know how much biomass is going to grow. So this is sun hemp. It's a summer legume, and it grows very tall even after one irrigation. So this is kind of that comparison. And then this is a picture of that same field after the flail mower and then the joker. And so again, it's very minimal disturbance, very minimal passes over the field, and a shallow depth of putting all that residue kind of away with that. Um, Animals are great no-till residue management. Definitely can be very effective tools for weed control, cover crop termination. Uh, I know that there's some challenges with livestock integration that we're kind of starting to do some work on, but in general, it's an excellent practice. Would be glad to chat more after this about it. But here are pictures of animals both in an orchard as well as in an open field. Animals, of course, are not going to be able to terminate a field in one day as a tractor could, but they're very effective for regenerative agriculture as well, and can bring many other benefits. However, animals do need water every day. That is one feedback I hear from farmers who start to work with animals, who are more plant people like myself. And so one farmer I know fabricated this piece of equipment with an old drum to avoid the need to bring water out to the field every day for the animals. So essentially, this gets filled with drinking water for the animals, and then there are troughs here on the side where they're able to refill it and maintain clean water for the animals and reduce the stress on their team um, from this incorporation. Uh, Furrow residue management can be very important as well. We do a lot of furrow irrigation in California, but just in general, having a lot of material in the furrow can be challenging. Here are two options for some furrow residue management. On the top right is the Orthman strip tiller. So in this case, these discs and rollers are behind the tires, and so they're kind of cleaning up residue in that furrow, not in the bed. However, this could be set up so that it's doing strip tillage in the bed and preparing the planting row as well. Really simplifies operations, and cleans up that residue. Another option is a furrow mower. So the strip tiller will do a little bit more incorporation into the furrow. In contrast, the mower will just chop that residue. So if you're doing like kind of trying to chop an annual cover crop that you know will be effectively terminated just with a mower, you can do something like this. And it's really helpful for furrow irrigation. And this can be set up again to kind of keep that residue clean in that furrow area. To briefly touch on compost, compost is a great way to add organic material into your field. What I want to draw your attention to in this picture is the size of the tires. This has balloon tires, so it really diffuses the weight of that spreader. Sometimes compost can come in with a lot of water and can be heavier for that reason. And so putting balloon tires on it can reduce the compaction from driving that equipment over the field. Um, Rice is a big commodity up where I work, but I know not in the whole state, so I'm not going to focus too heavily on it. But in this picture, I want to show you that in the front, there's a roller crimper with a drill seeder behind it. And so the grower is able to get away with essentially just rolling the cover crop down and then drill seeding the rice right into it. And so in one pass of the field, he terminates the winter cover crop and gets that rice right planted in. But in general, a roller crimper can be effective for kind of cover crop for getting cover crops to lie down. However, I'll show a picture later on of experience when this wasn't effective, and so there are risks with that. I would say if you're not sure if your cover crop is gonna die with a roller crimper and you haven't tried it before, then using an undercutting knife can be an extremely great insurance policy to make sure that you kill it, because I've seen it and I've heard about it where you roller crimp it, it stays flat, it looks great for a few days, and then it just pops right back up. So that's never fun. And then I'm going to hand it back over to Nick.
Great. Unmute myself. I wanted to give a big shout out to our colleague who's also on the Western Cover Crops Council, Doug Collins at Washington State University. He's doing some very ambitious research reducing tillage at incorporation. My work has been mainly at cover crop planting, for interseeding, but his work, like what Sarah's been sharing, is at incorporation. So he's got a long-term agricultural research site, and he's comparing conventional tillage, reduced tillage, and then livestock incorporation in long-term studies. And as part of that program, he's bought this high residue transplanter. And you can just kind of see from the photos, it's got disc openers and then pretty aggressive rollers that give the transplants good root, soil to root contact. Go ahead to the next slide. Yeah, hitting again. And then the latest thing that he's done most recently is bought, this isn't his, he doesn't have a picture of his in the field yet, but he bought, it's a belly PTO, so the power takeoff, which operates um, what movable equipment in the back, and usually they're mounted at the back of the tractor. Some tractors you can get with a front mounted or belly mounted PTO, so you can have like this flail mower incorporating a very large cover crop and weedy, it looks like weedy cover crop there in front of the tractor. So the one of the benefits is that the tractor's wheels aren't knocking down the cover crop, so you get better incorporation, right? Because and then you can also put another piece of equipment, for example, his high residue transplanter on the back. So just like Sarah was saying as well, multiple operations with one pass helps. There's a few older tractors that have these as well. He's bought a newer Kubota that has the front mounted PTO. Go ahead to the next slide. I think this is yours. Okay, so here's some of Doug's. This is 27 days after transplanting, um, and with different kale crops. Next slide. And this is, sorry, I'm jumping around a bit because this is interseeded cover crops as well. 51 days after transplanting, go ahead to the next slide, and 65 days after transplanting. And some of the growers, this is, I'm not sure, I wish Doug was here with us to share a little bit more details, but I think that the crop that's dying back there, I think that's because this is an overwintering kale crop, I think that's a winter non-cold hardy or winter killed cover crop. And some of the farmers I've been working with have also been interseeding winter killed cover crops into their overwintered vegetables. And that's right, pretty much at during harvest for his kale crops. And the final slide here, oh, it's a close up. Go to the next slide. Mainly eye candy because I'm not doing this work. So I don't want to say the wrong thing. Um, a till no till
Both kales
comparison.
look great with the tillage and no tillage, though.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And so one of the things that he's been finding is that heat loving crops are a little bit more difficult to use, to incorporate reduced tillage or no-till kind of approaches, because in the maritime Pacific Northwest, um, the higher residue and cover crops on the surface does kind of keep the soil surface a little bit colder, but cool season vegetables in general seem to perform quite a bit better. So back over to you.
Great, thanks. So I'm going to share a couple more examples from California of reduced disturbance. This is a picture of reduced disturbance following rice, maintaining good soil coverage over the winter. So in this case, there's still that rice straw really just in the ground, and then the cover crop is coming up there in green. Here's a little bit more detail and a close-up of that. So here's the vetch, and I believe it's a cereal rye maybe coming up as a mix within that kind of thatch. And so in this case, the grower flail mows after rice in the opposite direction of the harvester to get that material uh, chopped up, and then drill seeds the cover crop right into it, and the cover crop germinates. And so they don't have to do intensive incorporation of the rice straw. They wait, they hold off on it, and only and kind of delay and reduce their need for multiple cultivations. They then use grazing in the spring for the cover crop, and then flail mow. Then they disc in the rice straw, and then finally they irrigate it up for, this is an organic farm, and so they irrigate up to get the weeds to germinate. Then they do a really shallow cultivation, and then they're able to pull the beds, and then they go into an annual vegetable crop. And so in that way, they're able to transition from rice that's in, check floods without beds into a bedded annual crop without very much disturbance in that field, but with a huge increase in, they're planting a cover crop, they're integrating livestock, and they're reducing disturbance. So that's three big soil health practices in one, in sort of a challenging system. In a cool season vegetable operation in California, here's a picture of that. This is coming out of winter vegetables. The cover crop was planted in the early spring and then mowed in the late spring with residue left on the surface. In the fall, they did a strip tilling in the furrows with an undercutting knife for that morning glory, which was able to be pretty effective for getting it down, at least in that season. And then they followed that with the Yetter strip tiller and then planted a safflower, vetch, and phacelia cover crop, and then they'll go into onions in the spring. So in this example, they've had two cover crops in a year plus reduced disturbance with the equipment. And so I would say as many opportunities as possible to incorporate maintaining that living root and adding biomass are going to be great opportunities. However, things can go wrong. I was working with a grower who was interested in trying no-till termination. We picked a cover crop mix that we thought would terminate well with no-till. And I said, let's start small. And so we did it on 3 beds, and the cover crop stayed down for a few days. They planted tomatoes here in this picture on the left. There's a little tomato transplant, and then the cover crop just popped right back up, and the tomato transplants just couldn't compete. And so, would definitely recommend the best. We want to set people up for success with cover cropping and reduce disturbance. So, start small, use the equipment that you have. And if you're not sure if your cover crop, and pick a cover crop you can terminate well with the equipment that you have. So here's some final words of wisdom from some of the farmers that I've interviewed and talked to about regenerative agriculture. They share, I think sometimes when we talk to people who are role models and guides, we might forget that they have had hiccups and challenges themselves in the journey. And so it was kind of helpful to hear some of these words of reflection. So the first was, don't be afraid to try something. If you're interested in reduced or no tillage, see how you can try it on your farm. Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, and also be easy on yourself if something goes wrong. Make sure to plan in advance and give yourself time. Ultimately, you do have to make money on your farming operation. And many of the benefits are not quantifiable with regards to regenerative ag and soil health, at least in the short term. For example, insect activity in the spring, the impact of root exudates, water being kept on your farm instead of moving off. Those are really hard to kind of put into your bottom line, but are really great and important benefits. Don't get yourself into a high biomass situation if you cannot manage it. And also, if you run into a dead end, look at your equipment yard and think about the big picture concept of regenerative ag and try to kind of solve it with that. If you get frustrated, try not to go out and do like a big disturbing disc event. Think about how you might still maintain some of those principles. Um, so just to share a few resources, I have a lot on my website. SAC Agronomy, I saw in the chat, CAF posted some of their resources. At UC, we do have a lot of resources on soil health, some on livestock integration. Here's some from my website, just an equipment article that summarizes a lot of what I've talked about that I wrote with Brian Park, some cover crop performance variety trials in the Sacramento Valley. I'll draw your attention to the USDA Plant Material Center that's had a ton of trials that they have reports as well as my colleague Jeff Mitchell, who's been doing no-till work for quite a long time. And then, Nick, do you want to talk about this one?
Yes. Sorry, you heard my typing in the background. I didn't mute myself, but this is the Western Cover Crops Council resources website, and my research assistant, Cora Bobo-Schisler, has been helping us put these together. There's a QR code on the bottom right here that takes you to the WCCC homepage, and you can see how we're trying to organize. It's always tricky organizing large resource pages, but we're hoping that this will become kind of a one-stop shop in the Western US for cover crop resources and cover crop information. So if you have resources that you don't see on here yet, please send me, Sarah, or Cora Bobo-Schisler an email, and we'd be happy to review it for including.
Yeah, and we also would love, we'd welcome you to join as a member. We do have Sarah Tiffany from CAF on our Southwest Regional Committee. So we are trying to engage with everyone working in the cover crop world in the West in some capacity. And we are excited that our selection tool will be live here in the next 6 months, hopefully. We're hoping it'll be out this summer. With that, I really want to say thank you to a lot of the growers who have provided this information and shared pictures with us, as well as with our colleague researchers. This picture here in this slide is actually a picture of a 5-way summer cover crop mix that was drop seeded into corn that had already been planted. And so when the grower harvests their corn, they're left with the stubble, and then that mix comes up. And so that's another kind of innovative way to maintain a living root. We've been answering some of the questions as we go, but in our last 5 minutes, I guess we'll answer the rest. Um, for the first one, why no comparison with no-till? Sorry if that wasn't clear. That was no-till versus tilled with cover crop versus no cover crop. So that was included in that original trial in the beginning. Um, I'm going to read this one out loud. I'm curious of what you both think about integrating regenerative agriculture techniques on conservation lands. That is to say, uniting the productive function of working lands, whether that be polyculture, agroecology, regenerative agriculture, agroforestry, with conservation objectives to overcome colonial fortress conservation land use. Thank you for sharing your expertise. Um, I I'd have to think a little bit more about that. I work with regenerative practices in production ag land, so I'm not quite sure. I'd have to think about that. Nick, do you have a comment on that
Yeah, I
question?
didn't I didn't actually. I don't really work with conservation lands per se, but a lot of the folks, a lot of our colleagues at NRCS and soil and water conservation districts do exactly that. So, and they're some of the concepts that Sarah was talking about are, come from the NRCS as well. So I would reach out to them. They probably have more direct experience.
Yeah, thanks. Any particular tips or techniques about incorporating activated biochar? I mean, I would say you want to do it at a time when you're more likely to have microbial activity. So probably in the spring. I think a lot of times we put compost out in the fall when we go into that winter dormancy period. But with activated biochar, you might consider a spring application. Um, my main comment about biochar and the use of biochar, I used to do biochar research at the USDA and would be delighted to talk about biochar with anybody at another time. But my main suggestion with biochar is to find a local source. If you're moving biochar far from the original source, it isn't as much of an environmental win because you're using a lot of fossil fuel for it. So it really is a great waste management tool for things that are kind of organic matter in state. And then in terms of that activated component, people definitely are adding things onto biochar, charging it, et cetera, and just making sure you can keep those microbes alive when they get out into your field is best. And then it would be probably good also to have some other organic matter in there, like some residue that they can kind of get to right away because some of the carbon in biochar is what we call recalcitrant. So it's harder for the microbes to get at it immediately. And again, you just want them to have some food. Um, are there particular challenges with rice straw since the original solution was just to burn it? Um, yes, I would say rice is a really high C to N, high carbon residue. Growers are flooding fields now to try to break down some of that rice straw because they're no longer burning, which is great benefit to the birds and has restored a lot of our marshland bird habitat in the Central Valley. It's really a win for the environment as well as our agricultural community. But definitely having that high carbon input can be challenging. And so planting a cover crop. The other issue with rice is that the ground is really heavy. So my colleagues are doing some cover crop trials in rice now to see what species survive best. But some of that ground can be harder to get like a nice legume to establish well. So yes, there are challenges. And that's why the examples that I showed are so novel because in rice tends to be a very high tillage system in order to incorporate that. So finding opportunities to kind of reduce that tillage while incorporating other crops and doing rotations is pretty unique. Um, would growers welcome mobile biochar pyrolysis equipment that would come and process some crop waste? I certainly can't speak on behalf of all growers, but I have seen those mobile units when I was doing biochar research in Oregon. One of the biochars that we were using was mobile, produced mobily. They were going around and removing some of the invasive juniper trees and creating the biochar there in those units. And it's great. I think there are a lot of really cool applications with biochar, but it's sort of a world of its own, separate from some of the concepts, connected to the concepts, but could easily be another hour and 15-minute workshop in another day. I think that might be um, our
Yeah.
time today, but Nick and I are really easy to Google and find our emails, and I know I would welcome your questions and engagement, and I'm always happy to nerd out on biochar and other topics. So email me
Yeah, and
anytime.
somebody just asked who asked about mobile biochar. Muriel Strand. I hope you don't mind me mentioning your name, Muriel. Laura C was asking who was asking that. And somebody's just, oh, Muriel, great. You've just put a link in the chat. Laura, you might see that there.
Right. Well, we are at time. So I just really want to appreciate Sarah and Nick for both being here, sharing your expertise. I know I certainly learned a lot, and I think there's a lot of additional resources that were shared in the chat. We can also follow up with an email on Sked with additional resources. I know there was a lot shared today. It's hard to keep track of. So we'll try to follow up with additional resources. But thank you so much for being here and to all of you out there for joining us in this lovely workshop. And we hope to see you at the next conference workshop.
Thank you very much. And thanks for all the great questions and comments.
Yeah, thank you for the great engagement. Thank you, Evan.
All right.